Picture this. It's a quiet morning in the year 793 AD. The sun is just rising over the cold waters of the North Sea. On the small island of Lindisfarne, off the coast of what we now call England, a group of monks are beginning their morning prayers. They have no idea that their world is about to change forever. Suddenly, shapes appear on the horizon, long, sleek ships with dragon heads carved into their prows. The Vikings have arrived, and what happens next will send shockwaves through all of Christian Europe. But here's what most history books won't tell you. While everyone knows about the raid on Lindisfarne and the monks who died there, there's another story that's been largely forgotten. A story about the women of medieval England, the nuns who lived in convents and abbeys across the countryside. And what happened to them during the Viking Age is one of the darkest chapters in European history. Today we're going to explore this untold story. So if you're interested in real history, the kind that doesn't get sanitized in textbooks, stick around. This is going to be intense. Let's rewind a bit. Before the Vikings showed up, England was actually experiencing what historians call a golden age for religious women. From the 6th to the early 9th century, nunneries weren't just places where women prayed, they were centers of power, education, and culture. Here's something that might surprise you. Many of these convents were founded by queens and princesses. We're talking about royal women who had serious political clout. These weren't just religious institutions, they were almost like medieval women's colleges, combined with political power centers. Think about it this way. In a world where women had very few options, you could get married or, well, that was basically it. Nunneries offered something revolutionary. A woman could become educated. She could learn to read and write Latin. She could study theology, medicine, and music. Some nuns became famous scholars and authors. The most famous example is Hildegard of Bingen, who lived a bit later, but she represents what was possible. These nunneries owned land. They had economic power. The abbesses, the women who ran these places, often had the same authority as male abbots. They managed estates, made legal decisions, and advised kings. And here's the kicker. Parents actually, wanted to send their daughters to these places. If you were a noble family with multiple daughters, a nunnery was an honorable and even prestigious option. Your daughter would be safe, educated, and respected. She might not have a husband and kids, but she'd have a community, a purpose, and a secure life. The convents themselves were often beautiful places. They had libraries, gardens, workshops, where nuns created illuminated manuscripts, those gorgeous hand-painted books you see in museums. They had infirmaries, where nuns practiced medicine. They were self-sufficient communities that contributed enormously to medieval society. So when we talk about what was lost during the Viking raids, we're not just talking about buildings. We're talking about centers of learning culture and female empowerment that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. The Vikings arrive, understanding the raiders. Now, to understand what happened next, we need to understand who the Vikings actually were. First off, let's be clear. Viking wasn't an ethnicity or nationality. It was more like a job description. These were Scandinavian raiders, mostly from what we now call Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, who went on expeditions to raid trade and eventually settle in other lands. When someone went Viking, it meant they were going on one of these expeditions. The Vikings had a completely different world view from Christian Europeans. They worshipped Norse gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya. They had a warrior culture that valued bravery in battle above almost everything else. Dying in combat was seen as glorious. It meant you'd go to Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where you'd feast with the gods. Here's the critical point. They had *0*, respect for Christian religious sites. To a Christian European in the 8th or 9th century, a monastery or convent was sacred ground. It was God's house. Attacking it was unthinkable, not just because it was wrong, but because you'd literally be damning your soul to hell for eternity. The church itself was supposed to be neutral ground. Even in the middle of a war, you didn't attack churches. But the Vikings, they didn't buy into any of that. To them, these monasteries and convents were just buildings full of treasure guarded by people who couldn't fight back. It was literally the easiest score imaginable. And those treasures were real. Medieval churches and convents were loaded with valuable items, gold and silver chalices, jeweled crosses, illuminated books with gold leaf silk vestments, and sometimes just straight-up gold and silver coins. Remember, these places received donations from wealthy nobles and kings. They were basically medieval banks that happened to have prayer services. So from the Viking perspective, raiding a monastery made perfect sense. Low risk, high reward. Let's go back to that morning we started with. June 8th, 793 AD, Lindisfarne, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. One of our key historical sources describes what happened in these chilling words. The harrying of the heathen miserably destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne by rapine and slaughter. The Vikings hit the monastery like a tsunami. They killed many of the monks. They stole everything valuable. They burned buildings. Some monks were taken as slaves. It was brutally efficient and terrifyingly fast. The news spread across Christian Europe like wildfire. The scholar Alcuin, who was in France at the time, wrote a letter expressing his shock. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets. But here's what you need to understand. Lindisfarne was just the beginning. It was like a proof of concept. The Vikings had discovered that these raids worked, and they were going to do it again, and again, and again. Now we get to the heart of our story. What happened to the nunneries? Over the next several decades, the Vikings systematically targeted female convents across England, and the pattern was horrifyingly consistent. The convents had even less protection than the monasteries. While some large monasteries might have had walls or a few armed guards, convents typically had nothing. They were communities of women, mostly young women, and older abbesses living in what they thought was the safety of God's protection. When the Vikings came, there was no one to fight them off. Historical records from this period are fragmentary. Many were destroyed in the raids themselves. But from what survived, combined with archaeological evidence and later accounts, we can piece together what typically happened. The raids followed a pattern. The Vikings would arrive usually by ship, hitting coastal or riverside convents. They'd attack swiftly, overwhelming any minimal resistance. Then came the looting. They'd strip the church of its valuables, ransack the living quarters, take anything worth taking. But it wasn't just about theft. The historical sources make clear that rape was a systematic part of these raids. The nuns were assaulted, often gang-raped by multiple attackers. Some were taken as captives to be sold as slaves in Scandinavian markets or in other parts of the Viking trading network. And then often they were killed. The Vikings didn't want witnesses. They didn't want anyone left who might identify them or organize retaliation. Let me read you something from a medieval source that describes the fate of one convent when the Moors, a term sometimes used generically for non-Christian raiders, came. The nuns, fearing for their virginity, which they had cherished for so many years, mutilated their own faces with knives. When the invaders saw those bloodied faces, they became horrified and angry and ended by killing all the women with their swords. Think about what that means. These women were so desperate to avoid rape that they disfigured themselves, hoping that making themselves unattractive would save them. It didn't. They were murdered anyway. Here's a staggering statistic that often gets overlooked. By the end of the Viking Age, nearly all of the female monasteries in England had been completely destroyed. Let me say that again. Asterisk. Nearly all of them. Historians have documented that dozens of nunneries that existed before 793 AD were simply gone by the mid-9th century. Some were burned to the ground. Some were abandoned. Some tried to rebuild but couldn't attract new members because what parent would send their daughter to a place where this could happen? Compare this to male monasteries. Yes, many were raided. Yes, many monks died. But the institutions themselves often survived or were rebuilt. Male monasteries had more resources, more political support, and frankly, more security. The female convents, they just disappeared from the map. Think about what this means in practical terms. An entire infrastructure for women's education, female literacy, women's economic independence, gone. Just wiped out in the span of a few generations. Let's bring this down to a human level, because we're not just talking about statistics and institutions. We're talking about real people. Imagine you're a young woman. Let's call her Gifu. You're maybe 16 years old. You were sent to a convent when you were 7, which was common at the time. For 9 years, this has been your entire world. You've learned to read and write. You've memorized prayers in Latin. You've spent hours in the scriptorium carefully copying manuscripts. You've tended the herb garden, where the convent grows medicinal plants. You've sung in the choir. You have friends here, sisters in Christ, but also just sisters. This is your community. You've probably never seen violence in your life. The most dramatic thing that's ever happened was maybe when Sister Edith got caught sneaking an extra portion of bread and got scolded by the abbess. And then one morning you hear screaming. You see smoke. Armed men are pouring into the convent. They're shouting in a language you don't understand. They're grabbing the gold cross from the altar, the silver candlesticks, the jeweled reliquary that holds what's supposed to be a bone from a saint, and then they turn their attention to you. I'm not going to describe in detail what happens next. You can imagine, or maybe you can't, because it's literally the worst day of someone's life, and we can't really grasp that from a comfortable distance. What I will say is the trauma wasn't just physical. These were women who had dedicated their lives to God. They believed they were under divine protection, and many of them had taken vows of chastity. And in their worldview, being raped wasn't just a physical violation, it was a spiritual catastrophe. They believed their purity, their virginity, was their gift to God. Having that taken by force, it shattered their understanding of the universe. In the decades following the initial raids, the Viking attacks became more organized and more devastating. Eventually, Vikings weren't just raiding, they were conquering and settling. In 865, the great heathen army invaded England, and large parts of the country fell under Viking control in what became known as the Danelaw. But by then the damage to female religious life was already done. Parents stopped sending their daughters to convents. Why would they? It was a death sentence. The number of women entering religious life plummeted. Some nunneries tried to relocate inland, away from the coast and rivers. But they were poor, or they had lost their endowments, and they lacked the resources to rebuild effectively. Remarkably, a few nuns tried to continue their religious life in secret or in small groups. Historical records mention nuns who fled their convents and tried to maintain some form of religious community on their own. But without the institutional support, without the economic base, without the security, it was nearly impossible. Here's what really gets me. We'll never know how many women died. We'll never know their names. We don't have their stories. Medieval record-keeping was spotty at best, and the chaos of the Viking Age destroyed much of what existed. But we know this is an entire way of life for women. One that offered education, community, purpose, and safety was essentially eliminated from England for generations. Why this story matters today. So why am I telling you this story? Why does it matter what happened to some nuns over 1,000 years ago? First, because it's part of the historical record that often gets glossed over. When we talk about the Vikings, we often romanticize them. We see them in TV shows as heroic warriors, as adventurers, as complex anti-heroes. And sure, Viking culture had interesting aspects. Their shipbuilding was incredible. Their exploration took them from Baghdad to Newfoundland. They had fascinating mythology. But we need to tell the whole story. And the whole story includes systematic sexual violence, murder, and cultural destruction. Second, this story reminds us about the vulnerability of institutions that serve women. Throughout history, whenever there's chaos, conflict, or social upheaval, institutions that support women's education, women's autonomy, and women's safety are often the first casualties and the last to be rebuilt. Think about modern conflicts. When the Taliban took over Afghanistan, what was one of the first things they did? They shut down girls' schools. When ISIS controlled territory in Iraq and Syria, they systematically targeted women's rights organizations. This pattern repeats throughout history. Third, this story is about the erasure of women's voices from history. We know the names of Viking leaders. We know about kings and warriors, but we don't know the names of the nuns who died. We don't have their writings, their poetry, their thoughts. Their absence from the historical record is itself a form of violence, a second death, where even their memory is stolen. What happened next? The long recovery. It took centuries for female religious life to recover in England. When the Vikings finally converted to Christianity and settled down, essentially becoming English themselves, through intermarriage and cultural blending, new convents were eventually founded. But they were different. They were smaller, poorer, and more carefully guarded. The golden age of powerful, wealthy, culturally influential nunneries, that was over. It wouldn't return. Even when convents were re-established, they never regained the prestige and influence they had before the Viking Age. The later medieval period saw female religious life, but it was more restricted, more controlled by male church hierarchy, and more limited in scope. Some historians argue that the Viking destruction of female monasteries had long-term effects on women's status in English society. Before the raids, women could be powerful abbesses as scholars and landowners through the church. After the raids, and the subsequent reorganization of religious life, that avenue was much more restricted. Modern archaeology has added another dimension to this story. When archaeologists excavate sites of Anglo-Saxon nunneries, they often find a destruction layer from the 9th century evidence of burning abandoned valuables that were missed by the raiders, and sometimes heartbreakingly human remains showing signs of violent death. One excavation in England uncovered the remains of a religious building, probably a small convent or church, with clear evidence of fire damage dating to the Viking Age. Mixed in with the ash and debris were broken religious items and personal possessions left behind in a hasty abandonment. These archaeological finds give us hard evidence of what the written records describe. This wasn't just propaganda or exaggerated medieval chronicles. It really happened. Comparative context. Similar patterns worldwide. Here's something sobering. This pattern of systematic sexual violence against religious women during conflict isn't unique to the Viking Age. It's a pattern that repeats throughout human history. During the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, convents across Central Europe were raided by various armies. During the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, American soldiers attacked Catholic institutions in Mexico, including convents. During World War II, convents in Europe were targeted. During the Rwandan genocide in 1994, nuns were raped and murdered. The pattern is always similar. A protected institution for women seen as sacred or neutral becomes a target during conflict. The women are vulnerable, often unarmed, and the sanctity that's supposed to protect them means nothing to attackers from a different culture or world view. This isn't about demonizing any particular group. It's about recognizing a pattern in human behavior during warfare and social collapse. When law and order break down, marginalized and vulnerable populations suffer first and worst. Boom. The cultural memory, how stories shape us. The Viking raids on English nunneries became part of medieval cultural memory. Stories circulated about nuns who chose death over dishonor, who mutilated themselves to avoid rape, who became martyrs for their faith. These stories served multiple purposes. They were used to inspire religious devotion. Look at these holy women who were willing to suffer for Christ. They were used to demonize pagans and later to justify crusades against non-Christians. They reinforced certain ideas about female virtue and chastity. But here's what's interesting. Over time, the stories became sanitized. Later medieval chronicles would mention the raids, but downplay the sexual violence. Victorian-era historians, when they talked about the Viking Age at all, would delicately refer to outrages without specifying what that meant. It's only in recent decades, as historians have become more willing to directly address sexual violence as a historical reality, that we've started to reconstruct the full picture of what happened. So what do we take away from all this? First, history is complicated. The Vikings weren't just bloodthirsty monsters. They were people with their own culture, motivations, and worldview. But that doesn't excuse what they did. We can acknowledge the complexity while still calling violence what it is. Second, whose story gets told matters. For centuries, the story of the Viking Age was told from the perspective of kings and warriors, usually men. The stories of women, especially women who suffered violence, were marginalized or ignored. When we recover those stories, we get a fuller and more honest picture of the past. Third, institutional protections matter. The nunneries thought they were protected by religious sanctity, by God himself. But when push came to shove, without walls, weapons, or warriors, sanctity wasn't enough. This is a hard lesson about the difference between moral authority and physical power. Fourth, cultural destruction has long-lasting effects. When the Viking raids destroyed England's female monasteries, they didn't just kill women, they eliminated centers of learning, literacy, and culture. The loss echoed through generations. As we wrap up, I wanted to come back to where we started a quiet morning in 793 AD on the island of Lindisfarne. History remembers that raid. There are monuments to it. Scholars study it. It's in the textbooks. But on that same morning, and on countless mornings over the next century, women in convents across England woke up not knowing it would be their last day. Women who had devoted their lives to prayer, to learning, to serving their communities. Women whose names we don't know, whose stories weren't written down, who died violently and were buried in unmarked graves or not buried at all. This video is in a small way an attempt to remember them. to acknowledge that they existed, that what happened to them mattered, and that their loss diminished the world. The Viking Age eventually ended. The raiders became settlers, then Christians, then just English. The violence faded into history. New convents were eventually built, though they never quite recovered what was lost. But for a brief moment, those golden centuries before the raids, England had something remarkable: institutions where women could be scholars, leaders, and cultural creators, where a woman's mind and spirit were valued as much as a man's, where female voices were heard and preserved. The Vikings took that away, and it took nearly 1,000 years before women in Europe would have similar opportunities again. That's the story I wanted to tell you today. It's not a comfortable story. It's not the kind of Viking tale you see in movies or TV shows, but it's real, it's important, and it shouldn't be forgotten. Thanks for watching. If you found this video informative, please like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments, did you know about this aspect of the Viking Age? What other overlooked stories from history do you think deserve to be told? Until next time, remember, history isn't just about kings and conquerors. It's also about the people who suffered under them, whose voices were silenced, and whose stories we're only now beginning to recover. This narrative is based on documented historical sources, including the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, medieval ecclesiastical records, and modern scholarly research. While specific individual stories are reconstructed based on historical patterns, the overall events described, the systematic Viking raids on English nunneries, the resulting violence, and the near-complete destruction of female religious institutions, are historically documented facts.